basically, actually without exception, has agreed with the concerns that we've had. We have inquiries that are in process. But on the less sort of administrative bureaucratic side, I think that, like with a lot of films and sensitive topics in general, the trust building with the participants is a process, that is not, doesn't happen overnight. For example, the Haworth family, that was a long conversation to sort of, I think, have them be involved in the end. On the other hand, for example, former police chief Roger Chaffin, we were shocked at how keen he was to talk to us, which actually, as we learned, reflects a lot of his own problems that he has with the system as it stands, and hopes that he has for how things might be different. So there's a mixed bag there in terms of resistance and not, but certainly the institutional side, a lot of fighting. And, we note in the film the different entities that refuse to provide comment on the record, which I don't think we take personally. It's more just a reflection of certain attitudes bordering on impunity. It would seem that these entities seem to have in terms of transparency and communicating with the press.
Yeah, and I'm curious what impact that has on everything else that we look at.
Coming into this film, I don't think that we were, I think we were probably a bit naive about how well the institutions in this country function. I would say, certainly in comparison to where we are now. And I think at sort of every turn, we've been discovering how much discretion goes into what would seem to be decisions by government entities that are supposed to be sort of formulaic or objective, that actually there's a ton of discretion. There's a lot of ad hoc decision making, a lot of personal animus that's involved, and I think that it's nice to believe that everything is functioning, ticking along as it should, but I don't think it actually reflects the reality. And I think part of the reason why policing and some of these other institutions that we examine in the film, I think, are in the kind of crisis that they're in, certainly a moral crisis, is because of the sort of complacency over a long period of time.
So what's the feedback been like?
I think from people who have actually seen the film, because there are people who like to give us feedback without having seen the film.
That's kind of hard to do, isn't it?
Usually a challenge. Some people really are convinced that we are somehow, polemical, and that we hate the police, or that these ideas that this is somehow an anti-police film, which I don't think it is at all. But we have gotten sort of nasty, bordering on hate comments. We have gotten that from some quarters, but I think people who have actually engaged with the substance of the film, there is a lot of shock from folks. And the film is currently playing film festivals in, various parts of the United States and other parts, there's one in Bangladesh. The film is resonating with people, different parts of the world, and in places that are far beyond Calgary. And I think the reason for that is that it touches on a lot of things that are sadly quite universal. And the lack of accountability is something that, we constantly, as humans dealing with human institutions, we have to fight against, because it that's how things atrophy into a lack of accountability. So I think that, that kind of feedback has been very positive from people all over the place. And in Canada in particular, we saw a very strong response to the film in Calgary and across Canada. It was brought up many times in city council meetings. This is largely after the CBC broadcast in July 2020. So there was still the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. Various protests were ongoing, and the Calgary City Council did attempt to engage with these issues. And the film was pointed to as something that lays out many of these issues in a way that people could understand quite clearly. And that it was actually having a negative effect, I think, on some of the reputation of Calgary, and pointing out big systemic issues that were being overlooked. And I would say, if you've looked at the news recently, are still very much in play and are a huge problem. So I think the film is having that kind of a resurgence again in Calgary.
Yeah, I would think that this film would be a must-see for every city council around the world.
Yeah, you would think so. I mean, it's certainly there, like Robinder alluded to, and several city councillors in Calgary, in fact, we went out of our way to provide sort of an excerpt from the film that could be specifically used as a way of, kind of for educational purposes, so to speak, in that realm, which reflects the fact that I think that, and this sort of just relates to the broader purpose or value of this type of longer narrative engagement, is just the importance of the daily news is all good and well and is important, but I think that we've gotten the feedback on this film has really confirmed just how important it is to have detailed, thorough, lengthy engagements with particular stories, particular human experiences and tragedies, and how valuable that is in the context of people being able to empathize, being able to actually process the import and the effects when things are going wrong.
Well, there's no question that no visible trauma certainly pulls all of the key issues together, but the stories that are told by the participants is just mind-blowing.
Oh, yeah. And I think that, there are sort of a lot of stereotypes, so to speak, about who is usually impacted by police violence, essentially. And I think that, for example, both the Haworth and the Heffernan family, the Heffernan family, this is sort of like a classic Canadian, family from the prairies, retired school teacher and principal. This is not the kind of victims that people associate. And it does seem like, like that whole family really opened up to us. And despite the pain and the challenges involved. And, I think there's a lot of Canadians who can, relate to that family in a way that perhaps, Godfred's experience as a young immigrant, for example, is less relatable to them. So we think that there's also a value in that, in the diversity of the stories and the experiences.
So 2 questions. What's changed for you since releasing this documentary? And what change are you hoping for?
I don't think that much has changed since we have released the documentary. You mean on like a personal level?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, I'd have to go further back to when we started making the film, because that's while we were making the film is really when the transformation happened for me. And I think Marc pointed out, the institutional responses to these things, it continues to blow me away. And every time I think about it, I get quite animated. I think about Godfred, he's been charged with assaulting a police officer, even though there's this video of him being severely beaten. Calgary Police's own video. There's this video. He's being beaten while handcuffed by this police officer. The Crown prosecution looks at this and decides he should be charged with assaulting a police officer, which is a serious charge. His lawyer goes to them, looks at the video, says, hey, there's this video. Why are you doing this? Don't go forward with these charges. They took the thing all the way to trial. They used public funds to take this poor kid who has no money. They took him all the way to trial, which is a very expensive and lengthy process, upended his whole life after he'd already been beaten and left in the cold to freeze to death. These are supposed to be the sober adults in the room after the hectic police or whatever, but they're looking at this and they still decide to throw the full force of the law at this innocent person. And that really, that's what stayed with me. It's just that, these decisions get made all the time and they don't get noticed by us. And it's really important for us to, I think, at every turn, be questioning that kind of thinking, or to just accept that because a Crown prosecutor said it, it must be true. Or because someone, a minister said it, it must be true. I think that looking for the actual evidence is extremely important, and also not trusting that the system of accountability is functioning the way that it should be is incredibly important. And that's something that I've internalized it on a level with the Canadian context that I hadn't before.
So I'm curious, and this may be a naive question, but why with the footage of what was shown, would they prosecute? Why would they go forward?
Why would they possibly do such a thing? And we can hypothesize. We can hypothesize that maybe it's because when a police officer, because of the very, very close relationship between Crown prosecutors and the police, this is essentially some of them start to think of each other as a team, that they're on the same team of justice, that whenever something is even accused or lobbed that someone assaulted an officer, they feel compelled to, for whatever complex reasons, even with no evidence, take it all the way to trial. And that's really, I think in Godfred's case, so disturbing, because there was never even an allegation that Godfred had lifted a finger. It was a gestural assault, that he had begun to form a fist, and that was enough to take it all the way to trial. It's completely shocking that would be their assessment.
And I'll just add, I think the decision on behalf of the Crown, it reflects an impunity on behalf of certainly the behavior of police officers. It's actually, if we get into the full details, it's so much worse in the sense that also before the Crown was this information that, certainly emerged by the time that, over the course of disclosure, that it wasn't just this incident with Lindsay, with the tasering and then the the beating of this handcuffed man. A tasering, by the way, which, it's not even controversial, was in Godfred's lower back. So it's clearly, Godfred saying, well, I was trying to run away from this guy. I don't know how Lindsay's attempt to explain the circumstance, how it was that he was rolling around or whatever is really, I think, a bit tough to swallow. But the fact that there had been this previous experience with the other officers who functionally, I don't know any other way to define, if you, without due cause, put somebody in a vehicle and transport them from A to B. Like every single lawyer we've talked to says, well, that's sounds like kidnapping under the criminal code to me. So you have this detention without in violation of his charter rights. And this, again, I think if a civilian did it, certainly a kidnapping, but there's nothing in the criminal code that implies that if an officer does it, it's not a kidnapping. An incident that even their superior officer, the sergeant, was involved in. I mean, these are incredible violations. And here you have no internal review or consequences instigated by the police department. And you have the Crown looking at this and bullying forward with this court case. And as Joan Bloomer, his defense attorney, says, she says, where would we be without this video? It would be the word of this one young black man against, in the context of the trial, 3 different officers who testified. And she is not confident that without that video, that he would have been acquitted. So I think it reflects a terrible series of failings on a number of levels, both on the prosecutorial level, on the policing level, and it gets worse all the time. Like we just learned recently about there's materials that should have been included in the disclosure at Godfred's trial that weren't. I mean, and all of this reflects this systemic problem of like, well, when you have a criminal trial, who is it that puts together the disclosure? Well, wouldn't you know, it's the police. So in a case like this, where the police, the entire comportment of the police is so much at issue, it's still their colleague. In fact, the person that either concurrently or subsequently went on to be the very partner of the officer who is most directly involved is the one who put together the investigation. I mean, it's just really horrifying.
Having watched Above the Law and No Visible Trauma, it's hard to not feel that outrage. What can we do with it? How do we turn that from outrage into something that's more productive? So
I actually think that the good news is that there are any number of ways forward. I've said repeatedly that unlike a far more intractable problem, for example, addressing climate change, dealing with the comportment and rules that govern the behavior of our public officials and public employees really shouldn't be such a challenge. There are, for example, a number of obvious steps, and a lot of these are not endemic to the Calgary Police Service or even Alberta. For example, the Police Act in Alberta, which is the legislation that governs policing in that province, was last updated in 1990. And most of what's in it is far older than that, some of which even goes back to, common law. So even, for example, the Association of Police Chiefs of Alberta have called for, among other things, would be the civilianizing of the complaints, the professional standards process, essentially to remove the current situation, which is very much the police policing the police, to have an independent civilian body that oversees that. I mean, this is very obvious, very achievable. Not really something that, this is a simple thing. The more complicated side, for example, is, and the bigger discussion to do it, for example, and we've spent some time lately on panels and chatting with former police officers, but there's bigger issue to do with the culture of policing and the design of policing and what it's intended to do and where does it come from. And those are bigger questions in terms of, reallocating resources to at this point in time, again, that's not really controversial. We were just looking last night at a statement from Calgary Police saying that 80% of the incidents, at least 80% of the incidents that are involved in downtown Calgary involve mental health issues. So, I mean, I think at this point in time, there's broad agreement that non-police responses are important. So what that means is over time, reducing the number of police officers, moving that money into other realms. So I do think there's a number of very of ways forward. I think that as a society, we need to be willing to interrogate the status quo. And just because police have been doing this particular function in this part of the world for a number of years, they haven't always been doing that. And that doesn't mean that the way we've set it up needs to be how it is moving forward. In fact, I think there's plenty of argument that demonstrates that can't be the case if we want a more just and fair society.
Robinder?
Yeah, I agree. And I think looking at other models, and one that always sort of comes up, and I think for good reason, is the UK. Looking at that model of policing and is really important. And I think what we as a society have to do in Canada is say, we don't accept that it's okay that 30 or so odd people get killed by the police every year in this country. We should say no to that, because that's the number over the last 10 years on average. 30 people are just